The defendant is acquitted. The words slammed into me like a truck. The courtroom erupted in whispers and camera flashes. Mark Dalton, my former boss, straightened his tie and smiled that same charming smile that fooled everyone. The same smile he wore when he cornered me in my office 6 months ago. I sat frozen in the witness stand, my hands gripping the wooden rail. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at those gold cufflinks on his wrists, the exact ones he'd been adjusting while blocking my office door that night. The jury filed out without looking at me. His lawyer patted his shoulder like they'd just won a football game. Mark turned toward me once, that victorious smirk spreading across his face. He thought this was over. He had no idea what was coming. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like hungry vultures. Microphones shoved toward my face, cameras clicking non-stop. "Do you regret coming forward?" they shouted. "Will you appeal?" I pulled my coat tighter and walked past them all. "No comment," I said quietly. Because what none of them knew, what he didn't know, was that losing this battle had just given me the key to winning the war. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a software developer at TechFlow Solutions, a mid-sized company in downtown Seattle. Numbers and code were my language. Logic was my comfort zone. I believed that if you worked hard and played by the rules, good things would happen. I was completely wrong. I'd been at TechFlow for 3 years, climbing from junior developer to team lead. The pay was decent, enough to help my younger brother through college and still save a little. I loved solving complex problems, building systems that actually worked. My life was simple, predictable, safe. Then Mark Dalton became our new director. He was 42, divorced, with perfect teeth and expensive suits. Everyone called him charismatic. The board loved him. He'd supposedly turned around 2 failing tech companies before joining us. Within his first month, productivity was up 20%. He seemed like the kind of boss who actually cared about his team. He remembered birthdays, asked about families, stayed late when we had tight deadlines. I thought I was lucky to work for someone like him. I should have known that predators always wear the best masks. It started small. Mark would stop by my desk more often than others, complimenting my work. "Sarah, you're brilliant," he'd say, standing just a little too close. "You have real leadership potential." At first, I felt proud. Recognition from the boss meant something. But then he started commenting on other things. My focused energy. How I carried myself with confidence. The way I lit up a room. I brushed it off. Maybe he was just being friendly. During team meetings, he'd single me out for praise, but his eyes would linger too long. When he handed me project files, his fingers would brush mine deliberately. Small touches that could be explained away as accidents. Other colleagues started noticing. "You're definitely the favorite," my friend Jake whispered during lunch. I laughed it off, but something cold was growing in my stomach. The turning point came when Mark invited me to dinner. "Just to discuss your career path," he said, leaning against my cubicle wall. "Somewhere quiet where we can really talk." I politely declined, saying I had other plans. His smile faltered for just a second. Then it snapped back into place. "Of course. Maybe another time." That night, everything changed. The next morning, Mark barely acknowledged me. No friendly greeting, no stopping by my desk. When I submitted my weekly report, he marked it up with harsh criticism that made no sense. Code that had worked perfectly for months was suddenly inefficient and poorly structured. My project assignments started shrinking. Important meetings happened without me. Emails that used to include me in the loop suddenly didn't. It was like I was becoming invisible, one day at a time. I tried talking to him about it. "Is there something wrong with my performance?" I asked during one of our rare one-on-one meetings. He looked up from his computer with cold eyes. "I expect more from someone with your potential, Sarah. Maybe you're not as ready for advancement as I thought." The message was crystal clear. Play along, or get pushed out. I started documenting everything. Every missed meeting, every harsh review, every time he ignored my input. I had a feeling I'd need proof later. 2 weeks after I turned down his dinner invitation, he called me into his office for what he said was an urgent project discussion. It was Friday evening. Most people had already left. I should have said no. I should have insisted someone else be present. Instead, I grabbed my notebook and walked into his office. He closed the door behind me and turned the lock. "Have a seat," Mark said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His voice was different. Lower. More intimate. I sat down, notebook ready. "What's the urgent project?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked around his desk and perched on the edge, way too close to my chair. I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else. Something that made my skin crawl. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation," he said. "About your career path." "Which conversation?" I asked, though I already knew. "You know which one." His hand moved to my shoulder. "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I'm not just your boss, I could be your mentor. Your advocate. But that requires trust." I tried to stand up, but his other hand pressed down on my arm. "I should get back to my desk," I said. "No one's here, Sarah. It's just us." His grip tightened. "I can make things very good for you here. Or very difficult. The choice is yours." I looked toward the door. The lock glinted in the office lighting. "Let me go," I said firmly. For a moment, we stared at each other. Then he released me and stepped back, hands raised like he'd done nothing wrong. "I think you misunderstood," he said smoothly. "I was just offering career guidance." I stood up and walked to the door, my legs shaking. The lock clicked loudly as I turned it. "Sarah," he called as I opened the door. "I hope you'll think about what I said. About trust." I left without looking back. I drove home in a daze, hands trembling on the steering wheel. When I got to my apartment, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wondered if I was overreacting. He hadn't actually assaulted me. He just touched my shoulder and made some vague threats about my career. Maybe it really was a misunderstanding. But I knew better. I'd felt the menace in his voice, seen the calculation in his eyes. He was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before I broke. I went inside and wrote down everything I could remember. Every word, every gesture, every detail. Then I researched company policies about harassment. TechFlow had clear guidelines and a reporting hotline. On Monday morning, I called HR. "I need to report an incident with my supervisor," I told Sandra Walsh, the HR director. She scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. I brought my written account and laid out exactly what had happened. Sandra listened carefully, taking notes. "This is very serious, Sarah. We'll need to investigate thoroughly." I felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone was taking this seriously. "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll interview Mark and any potential witnesses. In the meantime, we'll make sure you're not working alone with him." I nodded, feeling hopeful for the first time in weeks. I had no idea how naive I was being. The investigation was a joke from the start. Sandra interviewed Mark, who denied everything. He claimed our meeting was purely professional and that I must have misinterpreted his mentorship style. "He says he barely touched your shoulder," Sandra told me during our follow-up meeting. "And that was only to get your attention about something on his computer screen." "That's not what happened," I said firmly. "I believe you're sincere, Sarah. But without witnesses or physical evidence, this becomes very difficult to prove." She recommended mediation between Mark and me to clear the air. I refused. You don't mediate with predators. Meanwhile, my work life became a nightmare. Mark started nitpicking everything I did. He'd call me into meetings just to criticize projects that had been approved weeks earlier. He questioned my time management, my technical skills, even my attitude toward teamwork. Other employees started avoiding me. No one wanted to be associated with the person who'd accused the popular director of harassment. I ate lunch alone and worked on projects by myself. Jake was the only one who still talked to me. "This is messed up," he said quietly during a coffee break. "Everyone knows he's been weird around women since he got here." "Then why won't anyone speak up?" I asked. He shrugged sadly. "Because he controls our careers." That's when I realized I was completely on my own. 3 months after my HR report, Mark called me into his office again. This time, Sandra was there too. "Sarah, we need to discuss your performance," Mark began, sliding a folder across his desk. "Your productivity has declined significantly, and we've received complaints about your attitude." I opened the folder. Inside was a formal write-up citing failure to meet project deadlines and difficulty collaborating with team members. All lies, but documented lies. "This is retaliation," I said, looking at Sandra. "He's punishing me for reporting him." "These are legitimate performance concerns," she replied. "Completely separate from your previous complaint." Mark leaned back in his chair, wearing that same smug smile from the courtroom. "Sarah, I want you to succeed here. But you need to focus on your work instead of other distractions." The message was clear. Drop the harassment claim, or lose my job. I signed the write-up because I had no choice. But I also made copies of everything and started looking for a lawyer. That night, I called my brother David. "I think I need to quit," I told him. "No way," he said firmly. "Don't let that creep win. Fight him." So I did. I found an employment attorney who specialized in harassment cases. Maria Santos listened to my story and agreed to take the case. "We'll file with the EEOC first," she explained. "Then decide whether to pursue civil litigation." Within a week, TechFlow received notice that I was filing a federal harassment complaint. The real war was about to begin. The company's response was swift and brutal. They hired a high-powered law firm and began building a case against me. Suddenly, every mistake I'd ever made at work was documented and magnified. Remember that time I was 10 minutes late because of traffic? Now it was a pattern of tardiness. The day I disagreed with a colleague's approach? Evidence of my difficult personality. Even my technical decisions were second-guessed and criticized. Mark played the victim perfectly. He told anyone who'd listen that I was a disgruntled employee trying to destroy his reputation because he'd given me honest feedback about my performance. "It's heartbreaking," I overheard him telling another director. "I tried to mentor her, and this is how she repays me." The investigation dragged on for months. I gave depositions, provided documents, answered the same questions over and over. Meanwhile, work became unbearable. People whispered when I walked by. I was excluded from important projects and meetings. My lawyer warned me this would happen. "They're trying to force you out," Maria said. "Make your life so miserable that you'll drop the case and quit." But I refused to break. Every day felt like walking through a minefield, but I kept detailed records of every incident. I had spreadsheets tracking Mark's retaliation, email chains showing how I was being isolated, and witnesses to some of his more obvious harassment of other women. Then something unexpected happened. The company's IT department was ordered to preserve all electronic communications for the investigation. That's when I got access to something that would change everything. During discovery, I received copies of company emails and system logs. Most of it was routine stuff, meeting schedules, project updates, budget discussions. But buried in the technical logs was something interesting. The access records showed that Mark had been logging into the company's financial systems at odd hours. Late nights, weekends, even holidays. For someone whose job was managing people, not money, that seemed strange. I mentioned it to Maria during one of our prep sessions. "It's probably nothing," she said. Let's focus on the harassment case. But I couldn't stop thinking about those login times. As a developer, I knew our systems well. Mark shouldn't have had administrative access to the accounting database. So why was he in there at 2 a.m. on a Sunday? I started cross-referencing the access logs with our project timelines. Every time Mark logged in outside business hours, it coincided with major vendor payments or budget approvals. Sometimes he'd be in the system for hours. One night, I stayed late and pulled more detailed logs. What I found made my blood run cold. Mark hadn't just been accessing the financial systems. He'd been modifying vendor records, changing payment amounts, and creating false entries. Over the past 2 years, he'd systematically embezzled over $400,000. I copied everything to an encrypted drive and locked it in my desk drawer. This wasn't about my harassment case anymore. This was fraud on a massive scale. I wrestled with what to do for days. The smart thing would be to turn over the evidence immediately. But I knew what would happen. Mark would claim I'd fabricated it to strengthen my harassment case. Without proper forensic analysis, it would look like a desperate move by a failing plaintiff. Instead, I decided to wait. Let the harassment case play out first. If I lost, the fraud evidence would be my backup plan. The trial began 6 months later. Maria had built a solid case, but Mark's lawyers were better. They painted me as an unstable employee who couldn't handle criticism. They brought in witnesses who testified about my declining performance and hostile attitude. Mark took the stand and gave an Oscar-worthy performance. He spoke about his dedication to the company, his mentorship of young employees, and his shock at my false accusations. I only wanted to help Sarah reach her potential, he said, looking directly at the jury. It's tragic that she's chosen to destroy both our careers over a misunderstanding. When I testified, his lawyer tore me apart. Why didn't I report the incident immediately? Why didn't I quit if I felt unsafe? Why hadn't any of my coworkers witnessed his harassment? Every answer made me sound paranoid or vindictive. I watched the jury's faces and saw doubt creeping in. On the final day, Mark's lawyer delivered a devastating closing argument. This case isn't about harassment, he said. It's about a disgruntled employee who can't accept that her work wasn't good enough. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. The defendant is acquitted. Those 4 words ended everything I'd worked for. Mark hugged his lawyers while photographers captured his moment of triumph. The jury filed out without looking at me once. Outside the courthouse, he held an impromptu press conference. This has been a difficult time for everyone involved, he said solemnly. I hope Sarah can get the help she needs and move forward with her life. Even in victory, he managed to make me sound mentally unstable. The media coverage was brutal. Tech executive cleared of harassment charges. False accusation rocks local company. Every article painted me as the villain while praising Mark's grace under pressure. TechFlow sent me a severance package the next day along with a non-disclosure agreement. They wanted me gone and silent. I tore up both documents and mailed the pieces back to Sandra Walsh. My legal bills had drained my savings. My reputation was destroyed. Most tech companies in Seattle wouldn't even interview me after Googling my name. I moved back in with my parents and took a part-time job at a coffee shop. For weeks, I barely left my room except to work. The humiliation was crushing. But late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about that encrypted drive hidden in my desk drawer. Mark thought he'd won everything. He had no idea what was coming. 2 months after the trial, I finally went back to TechFlow to clean out my desk. Security escorted me up to the office floor, where my former colleagues avoided eye contact. My desk had been cleared out and assigned to someone else, but HR had packed my personal items in a box. At the bottom, wrapped in an old sweater, was the encrypted drive. That night, I opened the files and began building a case. Mark had been stealing from the company for over 2 years. Fake vendor accounts, inflated invoices, mysterious consulting fees that went straight to offshore accounts he controlled. The pattern was sophisticated but not perfect. He'd gotten greedy toward the end, taking larger amounts more frequently. The total was now close to $600,000. I spent weeks documenting every transaction, tracing the money flow, and building a timeline. This wasn't just theft. It was organized fraud that violated multiple federal laws. But I needed help. This was too big for me to handle alone. I remembered David's friend Carlos, who worked as a forensic accountant for the FBI's white-collar crime unit. I called him and arranged a meeting at a downtown coffee shop. I need advice about a hypothetical situation, I told him, sliding a folder across the table. Carlos spent 20 minutes reviewing my documentation. His expression grew darker with each page. "This isn't hypothetical, is it?" he said finally. I shook my head. "Sarah, this is massive. We're talking about federal wire fraud, money laundering, probably tax evasion. If this is real, it could put someone away for decades. How do I report it properly?" I asked. Carlos smiled grimly. "Very carefully. And anonymously." We spent the next month building an airtight case. Carlos helped me organize the evidence and prepare a comprehensive report. Every transaction was documented, every fake vendor identified, every offshore account traced. The beauty of it was that Mark had done this to himself. I hadn't fabricated anything or planted evidence. I'd simply followed the digital trail he'd left behind. In December, 3 months after losing my harassment case, I mailed an anonymous package to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. No return address, no identifying information. Just 200 pages of evidence showing exactly how Mark Dalton had stolen over $600,000 from TechFlow Solutions. I also sent copies to the IRS, the Washington State Attorney General, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. If one agency didn't act, maybe another would. Then I waited. 4 weeks, nothing happened. I started to wonder if my package had been ignored or lost in bureaucratic shuffle. Maybe white-collar crime wasn't a priority. Maybe Mark's connections protected him. Then, on a rainy Thursday morning in January, I saw the news alert on my phone. TechFlow Solutions under federal investigation for financial fraud. I set down my coffee cup and smiled for the first time in months. The dominoes were starting to fall. The investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Within days, federal agents had raided TechFlow's offices and seized computers, financial records, and backup servers. The company's stock price plummeted as investors panicked. Mark tried to control the narrative, holding another press conference where he expressed full confidence in the investigation and promised complete cooperation with authorities. But his lawyer's presence beside him told a different story. You don't need criminal defense attorneys for routine audits. The local business press went into overdrive. TechFlow fraud investigation expands. Federal agents interview key executives. Company faces potential criminal charges. Mark's name appeared in every story, usually with the word suspended attached. The board had placed him on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome. I watched it all unfold from my parents' house, working my coffee shop shifts and following every development online. The same reporters who'd painted me as a vindictive liar were now calling Mark's integrity into question. 2 months into the investigation, a new headline caught my attention: TechFlow director arrested on federal fraud charges. The accompanying photo showed Mark in handcuffs, being led from his apartment building by FBI agents. His perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled. Gone was the confident smile he'd worn leaving the courthouse after beating my harassment case. That night, I called Maria Santos, my former lawyer. "Did you see the news?" I asked. "I did," she said carefully. "Interesting timing." "Sometimes the truth takes a while to surface," I replied. There was a long pause. "Sarah, I hope you had nothing to do with this investigation." "Why would you think that?" I asked innocently. "Because you're exactly smart enough to pull something like this off." The trial began 8 months later. This time, I wasn't the plaintiff or defendant. I was a witness for the prosecution. The FBI had traced every transaction I'd documented and found even more evidence of Mark's crimes. His offshore accounts contained over $800,000 in stolen company funds. He'd also failed to report the income on his tax returns, adding federal tax evasion to the charges. His defense team tried to claim he was being framed, but the digital evidence was overwhelming. Every fraudulent transaction had his authorization codes. Every fake vendor had been created from his computer. Every offshore transfer had been initiated during his late-night system access sessions. When I took the stand, the prosecutor asked about my discovery of the financial irregularities. I noticed unusual access patterns in the system logs. I testified truthfully. As a software developer, I was curious about why a personnel director needed administrative access to accounting systems. Mark's lawyer objected repeatedly, trying to suggest I'd fabricated the evidence as revenge for losing my harassment case. But forensic analysis had confirmed everything. The timeline, the transactions, the access logs, all genuine. During cross-examination, Mark's attorney got aggressive. "Isn't it convenient that you discovered this evidence right after losing your harassment lawsuit?" "Justice doesn't follow convenient timelines," I replied calmly. Fraud is fraud, regardless of when it's discovered. From the defendant's table, Mark stared at me with pure hatred. Finally, he understood what had happened. His harassment had given me access to the company's systems during discovery. His own crimes had provided the evidence that would destroy him. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. This time, I was in the gallery watching as Mark's world collapsed. Wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, guilty, guilty, guilty. His face went ashen as the judge read each verdict. The sentencing came 2 months later. 12 years in federal prison, full restitution to TechFlow, and forfeiture of all assets connected to his crimes. His apartment, his car, his offshore accounts, everything seized to repay what he'd stolen. Outside the courthouse, the same reporters who'd covered my harassment trial asked for comments. This time, I was ready. "Justice doesn't always arrive on schedule," I said into the microphones. "But it arrives." A reporter asked if I felt vindicated after losing my harassment case. "This was never about vindication," I replied. "It was about accountability." That evening, the local news led with the story. TechFlow executive sentenced to 12 years for fraud. The coverage mentioned my harassment case briefly, but focused on Mark's financial crimes. The comments section of every article was brutal. People who defended him after my harassment trial now called him a predator and a thief. His reputation was completely destroyed. His wife had divorced him during the investigation, taking their 2 children to another state. His professional network abandoned him entirely. Even his lawyers seemed eager to move on to other cases. I felt no satisfaction in his family's suffering, but Mark had chosen his path. Every crime, every lie, every moment of arrogance had led him to this federal prison cell. 6 months later, I received an unexpected call from Sandra Walsh at TechFlow. "Sarah, I hope you're doing well," she began awkwardly. "What do you want, Sandra?" I asked. "The company would like to offer you a settlement for your harassment claim. We recognize that the investigation shed new light on certain workplace dynamics." Translation: They now believed Mark was capable of harassment and wanted to avoid a lawsuit that would make them look incompetent for not investigating properly. "How much?" I asked. $200,000, plus a positive reference letter. It was more than I'd ever asked for in the original case. But it wasn't about money anymore. "I'll consider it," I said, and hung up. I never called back. Money couldn't restore my reputation or the year of hell I'd endured. But watching Mark get exactly what he deserved had been worth more than any settlement. 3 months later, I got a job at a small tech startup across the country. My new boss knew about my history and hired me anyway. "We need people who aren't afraid to do the right thing," he said during my interview. For the first time in 2 years, I felt hopeful about my future. On my last day in Seattle, I drove past TechFlow's office building. A large "For Lease" sign hung in the lobby window. The company had folded 6 months after Mark's conviction, unable to survive the scandal and massive legal costs. Over 100 people had lost their jobs because of one man's greed and arrogance. I felt sorry for my former colleagues, but they'd made their choices too. When I'd needed support, they'd chosen their careers over doing what was right. Jake was the only one who'd reached out after Mark's arrest. "I should have backed you up," he said during our coffee meeting. "I was a coward." I appreciated the apology, but it was too late to change anything. That evening, I packed the last boxes into my moving truck. Hidden in my laptop bag was a backup copy of the encrypted drive, the evidence that had brought down Mark Dalton. I'd probably never need it again, but it served as a reminder of what one person could accomplish with patience and determination. My phone buzzed with a news alert: former TechFlow executive begins prison sentence. The article mentioned that Mark had been transferred to a medium-security federal facility in Texas. He'd serve at least 10 years before being eligible for parole. I deleted the alert and started driving east toward my new life. 2 years later, I was working as a senior developer at an Austin-based cybersecurity firm when I got another unexpected call. "Is this Sarah Chen?" the voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Jennifer Walsh. I worked with Mark Dalton at his previous company, Meridian Tech. I saw your name in some news articles about his case." My blood went cold. "What do you want?" "I think he did the same thing to me that he did to you. Both the harassment and the financial fraud. I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk." We met the following week at a coffee shop in downtown Austin. Jennifer told me a story that was frighteningly familiar. Mark's inappropriate behavior, the retaliation when she rejected his advances, and suspicious financial activities she'd noticed before being forced out of her job. "I tried to report the harassment, but HR buried it," she said. "I had no idea about the fraud until I saw your case in the news." I listened to her story and realized Mark's crimes went back further than anyone knew. He'd been perfecting his predatory behavior for years, moving from company to company whenever things got too hot. "What do you want to do about it?" I asked. "I want to stop him from doing this to anyone else," she said firmly. Even from prison, Mark was apparently appealing his conviction and claiming he'd been framed. His lawyers were arguing that the evidence had been planted by a vindictive former employee, meaning me. Jennifer's testimony could change everything. It would establish a pattern of behavior that went back years, making his claims of innocence completely absurd. I gave her my lawyer's contact information and promised to help however I could. The appeals process took another year, but Jennifer's evidence was devastating to Mark's case. She'd kept detailed records of his harassment and had noticed the same financial irregularities at Meridian Tech that I'd found at TechFlow. The FBI reopened their investigation and discovered that Mark had stolen from Meridian as well. Another $200,000 in fake vendor payments and inflated contracts. He'd been running the same scam for over 5 years. His appeal was denied, and additional charges were filed for the Meridian fraud. The new conviction added another 8 years to his sentence. 20 years total. He'd be in his 60s before seeing freedom again. I testified at the second trial via video conference, explaining how I discovered the financial irregularities at TechFlow. This time, there was no question about my motives. I was simply a whistleblower who'd helped expose a career criminal. After the verdict, Jennifer called to thank me. "He can't hurt anyone else now," she said. "That's all I ever wanted," I replied. But it wasn't quite over yet. 3 months after Mark's final sentencing, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. The return address showed it was from the federal prison in Texas. Inside was a handwritten note from Mark himself. "Sarah, I know what you did. You think you're some kind of hero, but you destroyed dozens of lives when TechFlow went under. My kids will grow up without a father because of your vindictive crusade. I hope you're satisfied with your revenge. MD." I read the letter twice, then shredded it. He still didn't understand. This was never about revenge. It was about accountability. He'd made the choice to harass employees and steal from his companies. I'd simply ensured that justice was served. That same week, I got a LinkedIn message from another woman. "Hi Sarah, I worked at Cyberdyne Solutions when Mark Dalton was COO there. I'd been following his legal troubles and wondered if we could talk." Mark's criminal career apparently went back even further than we'd known. This woman, Rebecca Martinez, had experienced the same pattern of harassment and suspected financial fraud at Cyberdyne, his first job as an executive. I connected Rebecca with the FBI agents who'd handled Mark's case. They were very interested in her information, particularly since it showed his crimes had been going on for over a decade. By now, the pattern was undeniable. Mark Dalton was a serial predator who used his position of authority to exploit women and steal from his employers. My harassment case hadn't been an isolated incident, it was just the first time someone had been brave enough to fight back. The Cyberdyne investigation led to even more charges. Tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges that could add another 15 years to Mark's sentence. At this point, he'd likely die in prison. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source. Rebecca had kept in touch with other Cyberdyne employees, and several women came forward with their own harassment stories. The FBI began investigating Mark for a pattern of sexual harassment spanning 3 companies and over a dozen victims. While the statute of limitations prevented criminal charges, the evidence was overwhelming. Major news outlets picked up the story. Tech executives' decade-long crime spree exposed. Serial predator sentenced to life in prison. Whistleblower's courage saves future victims. For the first time, I was portrayed as the hero rather than the villain. Editorial writers praised my persistence in the face of a hostile corporate culture. Victims' rights groups invited me to speak at conferences. I declined most of the attention. This had never been about making myself famous. It was about ensuring that Mark Dalton could never hurt anyone else. The final vindication came when TechFlow's insurance company sued Mark for the full cost of the company's collapse. They argued that his crimes had directly caused the business failure, making him liable for over $50 million in damages. He'd never pay it, of course. But the lawsuit established legal precedent that predatory executives could be held financially responsible for destroying their companies through criminal behavior. 5 years after my harassment trial, I was invited to speak at a conference on workplace ethics. The organizers wanted me to share my story as an example of how one person's courage could make a difference. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of HR professionals and corporate executives, I thought about how much had changed. Mark was serving what amounted to a life sentence. The companies he'd worked for had implemented stronger oversight procedures. Several other executives had been prosecuted for similar crimes after employees came forward. People often ask me if I regret filing that first harassment complaint, I said into the microphone. The answer is no. Not for a second. I talked about the importance of documenting everything, finding allies, and never giving up in the face of institutional pressure. I emphasized that justice sometimes takes years to arrive, but it's worth the wait. After my speech, a young woman approached me. "I'm dealing with a similar situation at my company," she said quietly. "My boss has been inappropriate. But he's well connected, and I'm afraid no one will believe me." I gave her my card. Document everything. Find a good lawyer. And remember, predators count on victims staying silent. She nodded and walked away with more determination in her step. That night, I video-called my brother David, who was now a successful engineer in California. "I'm proud of you," he said. "What you did took incredible courage." "I just did what was right," I replied. "That's exactly why I'm proud." Today, I work as a senior security consultant, helping companies build better systems to prevent both cyber attacks and internal fraud. My experience with Mark taught me that the greatest threats often come from inside organizations, not outside. I never married or had children. The trauma of those early years made trust difficult, and I chose to focus on my career instead. But I have a good life filled with meaningful work and close friendships. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just quit TechFlow after Mark's first inappropriate advance. Would other women have been spared his harassment? Would the companies have survived his theft? But dwelling on what-ifs is pointless. I made the choice to fight, and that choice saved other people from becoming his.